Welcome to Shute Festival and to our final event for 2020. We've got people joining us tonight from Shute, of course, from all over the southwest of England, from the rest of the UK, but also from all over the world. Miami, Mexico, Kiev, Berlin, Vienna, Geneva, and many more places. It's great to have you all here. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Sam Knights, and I'm one of the directors of this festival, rooted in the rolling hills of Devon, but which this year at least has taken all our events online and made them available to you wherever you are. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with Philippe Sands this evening, and I actually cannot think of a better way of ending our festival programme this year. Philippe is a law professor, barrister, an arbitrator specialising in international law. He's also, on a personal level, been an amazing mentor and friend as a fellow member of Matrix, and has been instrumental in my career as a human rights lawyer, as well as a source of enormous inspiration. But Philippe is also, of course, a writer and broadcaster, author of Lawless World, Torture Team, the award-winning East-West Street, and co-producer of the film My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did, which brought together Nicholas Frank and Horst von Wachter, sons of senior Nazis who have diametrically opposing views of their fathers, who collectively were responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews and Poles in the war. Philippe, we're here tonight to talk about your new book, The Ratline, and the very curious story of the lives of Otto von Wachter, governor of Krakow in Galicia, and his wife, Charlotta. An investigation which was based on years of research into literally thousands of documents and spanning many parts of Europe. As with East-West Street, it feels too like a very personal book set against the backdrop of your own family history during the war at the hands of the Nazis, together with your emerging relationship with Otto's son, Horst, who doesn't want to think of his father other than as a good man. I'm going to hand over to you, Philippe, initially to sort of talk and introduce us to the book, and then I'm going to probe you with some of the themes that I want to talk about emerging from your book before turning to our audience, who will no doubt have lots of questions. And Philippe, by the way, likes difficult questions, so put questions to Philippe in the question box and chat on the right-hand side. Philippe, welcome. It's lovely to have you here.
Hi, Sam. It's incredibly nice to be here. I wish I was in Shute personally in person. I was in Devon last week to see my lovely aunt in Totnes. I love Devon. So we will try again in person. But this is great for now, and thanks all for joining. How exciting there's so many people from all over the world. I thought what I'd do is just spend 10 minutes just giving you the context, and then, Sam, you fire away with whatever questions are of particular interest to the fine folk of Shute. The Ratline is sort of a sequel, although it doesn't really matter which order you read them in. There will be a third book, which I've started writing, which maybe we can come back to later. But the whole project is sort of an accident. In 2010, so 10 years ago now, I received an invitation from an obscure university in an obscure city called Lviv. Would I come and talk about the cases that I've done, I'm doing on crimes against humanity and genocide? And I say yes, not because I've got a burning desire to give a lecture, but because I want to go to Lviv. And the reason I want to go to Lviv is that my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, was born there in 1904. I knew him very well. He lived until 1997, but he never talked to me of the years before the war or Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov, the city. So I thought, I'll go, it'd be interesting. I went, it was interesting, not least because I stumbled accidentally across the amazing sort of information that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity came from Lviv, Hersch Lauterpacht, famous international lawyer, and the man who invented the concept of genocide studied at Lviv University, Raphael Lemkin. So there was this amazing point of connection. And I started writing a book that I thought would be about three men, Leon, Lauterpacht, and Lemkin, and Lviv, the four L's. And then a fourth man came into the story, Hans Frank, Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland, formerly Hitler's personal lawyer from 28 to 33. And I prepared the research as I would prepare a case in an international court. I just read everything. I work with wonderful colleagues, some at Matrix, some beyond, and work in teams. And you just sort of want to sweep up everything you can find. One of the things that I found about Hans Frank was a book published in German in 1987 called Der Vater, the Father, by Nicholas Frank, one of the 5 children of Hans Frank. And it was a sort of excoriating letter of hatred of his father. And I thought, I want to meet this man. He sounds interesting. I tracked him down. We met in Hamburg. Actually, I was doing a hearing, Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And the first minute I met him, Nicholas, who has become a very dear friend, said, Philippe, you have to understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except the case of my father. Well, we became mates. And at some point he said to me, you know what, Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg, Lviv. Would you like to meet the son of the governor of Lemberg? His name is Otto Wachter, the governor. The son is called Horst. And I'm in good contact with him. We're friends, and I'm sure he would be happy to meet you. We met, and one thing led to another. He's an interesting character. I like him. We have very different views about various things. And he's diametrically opposed to Nicholas. He loves his father. Yes, he says the Holocaust happened. Yes, terrible things happened. Yes, my father was in the SS and governor, but no, he didn't do anything that was criminal. He has, I think, a state of denial about his father. Anyway, one thing led to another. I wrote a piece for the Financial Times, a profile of Horst. Then we made the film that you mentioned. And in the midst of filming, Nicholas, on camera, said, I think Horst could be a new kind of Nazi, which I disagreed with, and said on camera that I disagreed with. Nick, in fact, ended up retracting that, but Horst was mightily unhappy by that characterization. His view was that he's not and he isn't, and that he persisted in his view that his father had done a great job. He'd helped create a sense of Ukrainian identity, and so on and so forth. So Horst says to me, what can I do, Philippe, to prove that I'm not a Nazi? Which is a sort of, you all know, Sam, proving a negative in court or proving a negative anywhere is difficult. I said, well, you don't have to prove you're a Nazi because you're not a Nazi. And he said, well, no, I want to show that I'm not. So I thought about it, and I came up with an idea that was based on the fact that Horst had shown me 1 or 2 items from the vast archive his mother had gathered from the moment Charlotte met Otto in 1929 until he died in 1949, and then beyond, her reminiscences and collections afterwards. So he said, I said to him, why don't you give that to a museum? And then researchers can pore over it and form a view as to whether your dad was a decent bloke or, as I say, a mass murderer who would have been hanged if he had been caught and tried. Horst said, it's a deal. We arranged to send the material to Washington, to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They digitized it, absolutely beautiful. Anyone who's interested, it has just 2 weeks ago gone online. So just type in Wachter Archive, Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, and you can just look at the whole thing yourself and form your own view. Lots of photographs. It's incredible material. On the basis of that material, I was really able to write a story that described what Charlotte and Horst did. And of course, when I first met Horst, what I was interested in was the period up to 1945. He goes up the greasy pole. He's participated in the killing of Chancellor Dollfuss in Austria in 1934. He flees to Berlin. He comes back after the Anschluss in 1938. He stands on the famous balcony overlooking the Heldenplatz with Charlotte 1 meter from the Führer. And then he has a decision to take. Do I carry on working as a lawyer, or do I go into government? Something that many of our colleagues face, in these days or in our times. It's a similar sort of question. What do I want to do with life? And it's Charlotte who pushes him towards government service. And then the horrors begin. And I've always thought of that as an absolutely crucial moment, because if she had said, no, stay out of this nonsense, stay in the law, but she was herself ambitious, deeply anti-Semitic, and loved the parties and the Salzburg Festival and Bayreuth and the film premieres with Leni Riefenstahl. I mean, they were absolutely top table Nazis. And the diaries and the letters describe him going off to Krakow, building the Krakow ghetto, starting the process of what led to the genocide of Jews and others. And then he's posted in 1942 to Lemberg to implement the final solution, which, of course, as you said, brings a connection with my own family, because this is the man who oversaw the the extermination of my grandfather's entire family. So it's a very personal connection. And then, of course, the war comes to an end. And I'd never really been interested in what happened afterwards. But now, armed with this material, which was astonishing beyond the full extent of the meaning of the word astonishing, a whole new vista opened up, not least how Otto escaped. And it turned out that he had hooked up on the 9th of May 45 with a young Waffen SS soldier called Buko Ratman. And I will never forget the moment in December 2016 in Horst's tumble-down Schloss in northern Austria, when I started peppering questions to Horst about Buko. What was he like? Why did he help your dad? What happened to him after, in the 50s and 60s? What was his motivation? What did he do during the war? And Horst, very sweetly, because he's a gentleman, just looked at me and said, with his merry twinkle in his eye and a smile, he said, well, Philippe, I can answer all of your questions, all of them, or we could telephone him. So that was December 2016. And I'm thinking, well, he's got to be ancient, because this was 71 years ago. And he is ancient, but 6 weeks later, we were with Buko Ratman. And it was incredible to be told firsthand how they escaped for 3 years from the Americans and the British and the Poles and the Jews and the Soviets. He was indicted for mass murder, crimes against humanity and genocide. He lasted 3 and a bit years in the mountains. Then Buko's mum decided enough was enough. In fact, Charlotte had been a bit mean and had failed to disclose to Buko's mother that her beloved son was alive and harboring Otto in the mountains. So at the moment she told Mrs. Ratman that dear Buko was alive, Mrs. Ratman marched off to get her son down from the mountain. Otto couldn't survive. He comes down, and the question is, what do you do? You're a Nazi on the run, you're hunted. All of your mates have either A, committed suicide, or B, been hanged, having been convicted of mass murder, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes. And he decides the only solution is to head for Argentina, which means the first stop is Rome. And with the archive of Charlotte, we have the totality of the material. Everyone who helped him, how he gathered papers, what his plan was to get to Argentina. The only difficulty for us as researchers was because he and Charlotte believed they were being monitored or were fearful of being found out, all the names are anonymized. And so we spent 4 years working out who was who. We worked it out actually with, turns out, absolute precision. He was about to head off to Argentina. He goes to visit an old comrade. If you ever see the words old comrade, it means member of the SS, in Castel Gandolfo, which some of you will know as the Pope's summer residence, Lake Albano. Spent a wonderful weekend there, comes home to Rome, to the Vigna Pia monastery where he's living, writes a long letter to Charlotte. It was marvelous. The food was marvelous. The company was marvelous. Describes in full the characters, but never names them. And says, oh, I've fallen ill. And he never recovers. A week later, he is dead. And Horst believes that he was murdered, that he was poisoned. And that takes us to the final part of the book. So I didn't know any of this when I started. You literally, I think, could not invent it. If it was fiction, people would say it's not possible. Anthony Beaver actually did say that. He believed it because he saw my footnotes and endnotes and supporting material, but he said, you couldn't invent this stuff. Over to you. That's the introduction.
Wonderful. Yeah, I absolutely agree. You couldn't make it up. I wanted to start by asking you a bit about the mindset of Otto. I mean, I was studying the Third Reich as a special subject in the 90s at university, and there was a sense then that there was a huge amount already written about this period. You know, what else could there be? But in fact, there were huge gaps, not least this sort of in-depth examination of individuals, which is what we have in the Ratline, and not just the men, but also the women behind the men. You know, the focus was very much on Hitler, who was presented as a sort of fanatic, a racist and a political opportunist, but the other senior Nazis seemed a bit obscure. But I think what's really interesting in the Ratline, so we get a real sense of Charlotta, as you say, because of her diaries. Now, Otto's diaries were dumped in Lake Zell. Do we really get a sense, do you think, of his motivations? Was it the commitment to Hitler? Was it the personal ambition, power? What do you take away from everything that you've read?
I think we do. I think we have a very, very clear sense. Highly intelligent, highly nationalistic, deeply anti-Semitic, traumatized by the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the desire to find once again greatness. Shades, I'm not saying it's a direct parallel, but shades of modern Britain, perhaps. The desire to find old glories, to retain control, to have to be sovereign over your destiny, all very familiar, except that it took him obviously in a diabolical path. One of the things that is very clear to me, we've got all of his letters, so it's true that his work diaries, he destroyed his work diaries, or at least he asked Charlotta to destroy them, which he did, which happened in the 2 weeks after the war, because they were very worried that they would be incriminating. But we have all his letters, and they give away a lot. And one of the things that is very clear, and I'm asked a lot, doesn't this prove the banality of evil? And I say no, actually, it proves the very opposite of the banality of evil, because Hannah Arendt's thesis about the banality of evil essentially posits that these people didn't really think about what they were doing. They just went about their daily humdrum business, followed orders, didn't reflect. That is absolutely not the case with Otto Wachter. He was a true and total believer. And you find it in the private correspondence. I've always believed the late Lisa Jardine, to whom the book is in part dedicated, who'd become a friend, dedicated her life to the role of private correspondence in understanding big events. Her idea was that actually it's not in the public documents, in the public statements that you find the truth, it's in the family letters. And this proves that, because I can give you one example. Late 1941, his father, a retired general, former Minister of Defense, a very authoritative character, writes to his son and says, look, my darling Otto, I've got a bit of a problem. A friend of mine married a Jew. They've produced a child. They live in your region. And the child has now been subject to the anti-Jewish laws. Could you possibly take a look at it? Could you intervene? Could you do something to help? Otto says, of course, father, let me look into it. He does look into it. He writes back an absolute chilling letter, which basically says, well, I've looked into it, and it's true, everything that you've told me, but I'm afraid, darling papa, we need these laws, and these laws protect us against such people, and it's of vital importance that they be applied to everyone without distinction, no exceptions. I'm not going to do anything. And in that letter, and there are many other such letters, you get this chilling sense of not banality, but absolute purpose and commitment and ideology. He was foursquare behind the elimination of Jews, the removal of Poles. Really brutal stuff. But I think even more significant, I think if the book is original in any way, in a real sense, it's not Otto, it's Charlotta. Because what we've never had before, I'm not aware of any other material, is the spouse of a senior Nazi. And it's plain that she is completely complicit. She knows everything. She supports everything. Right at the end of the war, spring of 1945, she writes to dear Otto, it's terrible, we're going down, it's coming to an end. Why can't we, the Germans and the Austrians, enter into an alliance with the British against the Soviets? Why can't we do? She always loved England. She would come. She was a designer of fabrics. She'd come regularly to England. She loved England. She knew Mosley. She, felt that the English, not the British, the English were actually truly nationalistic, far more than the Germans and the Austrians, which is, again, very interesting for our times right now. And then she says to her husband, no, of course it's impossible. It's never going to happen. And it's never going to happen because of the Jews. They're always contaminating everything, always causing trouble. They'll always, intervene and stop us entering an alliance with the English. Absolute true believer, completely committed. And I think that's the insight that we get. That's the mindset that we get. And the total brutality of these people. I mean, I'm a university teacher. You know, in 1939, Otto Wachter is state secretary, charged with the removal of Jews and other public other undesirables from all public office. Everything from ministers of justice to postmen and factory workers working in the public sector, out. And two of the people he personally targets are his own teachers at the University of Vienna law faculty, famous professors of law, his own teachers, his own dean, who signed his graduation certificate in 1925. He personally removes him from his job, which contributes to his being consigned to deportation and death a year later. And so you've got to ask yourself, what sort of person is willing to do that? And I think we have all the answers in this material.
Yeah, I was going to actually bring up that that reference because I found that, you know, that in particular very, very chilling. And also, I mean, when you talk about Charlotte, you know, she's, you know, as you say, she's deeply anti-Semitic, yet at the same time, she's very well educated. She's very cultured. She's socialized and social. You know, she's actually travels around Devon and Cornwall. She goes to Totnes and Cornwall. In 1926, and
which is incredible for a woman, for a lady in 1926.
Right, and you know, and she's freely expressing her anti-Semitism in her diaries. So, I mean, we take from that these views are prevalent at the time and socially acceptable. I mean, to what extent do you think these are widespread, widely held views at the time in the 20s? In Germany,
they are widely. I mean, they're widely. I don't know what widely held exactly means, but yes, I mean, you know, it was for her to utter these kinds of things was quite normal in those days. I mean, it's clear that after the war, she toned things down. She, while her husband goes into hiding, she reinstalls herself, ends up in Salzburg, and by the 1950s, after he's died, she's running a place called Haus Wartenberg, which is a pension in Salzburg. It still exists today. I've been. If you're in Salzburg, go and have a look. And she runs a German language school. And she uses her beloved son Horst to attract young female students. Horst tells rather hilarious stories of being made by his mother to walk up and down the street in his lederhosen, looking attractive. He's an attractive man, and trying to encourage people to come enroll at Tante Lottie's language school. Well, since the book's come out, I've had a string of amazing letters from people who were Tante Lottie's, Charlotte's pupils in the 60s, the 70s. And to a man and a woman, they all write about how lovely she was, how she looked after them, how she took them to the opera on the 31st of December, how homely she was. She would make reference to her husband who'd been killed in the war, some lowly, German soldier, and people would be very sympathetic. And of course, they had no idea until they read the book what the story was. And the letters are very, very touching. There's one in particular from a priest who wrote to me, a man now in his late 80s, who wrote to me from St. Louis in the United States, just absolutely devastated to discover who Charlotte Wachter really was. So she could put on a front. She could definitely put on a front. I mean, I think if we were to sit down and have supper with her, it would be interesting. She'd be characterful.
Right. I mean, these are both very rounded characters. I mean, Bucco describes Otto, when after he spent time with him in the mountains, and says to Horst, he wasn't an evil man. He was comradely. They were good friends. And so there's this horrible juxtaposition with the ability to commit absolute atrocity and yet at the same time be a civilized, cultured, interesting person. But I wanted to ask you next about the sort of how your book fits in with the historiography of the Third Reich overall, and these sort of ideas that are still being debated to this day, about responsibility and, how widespread, or rather how controlling Hitler was, and how much of it was him and how much of it, in fact, was just lots of other people. I mean, what has been the reaction in Germany to your book?
The book only came out 2 weeks ago, 25th of November, and the reaction's been very interesting. There've been already a few reviews, all positive. Every review always has points that they like or dislike, but very, very positive. But most interestingly of all, the print run sold out in a week, and then the second print run sold out in the second week. So it's gone already into a third printing, which has surprised Fischer, the publisher. I was going to do a series of events now in Germany, but obviously for reasons of COVID, that hasn't been happening, and it's been pushed back to next spring. I think it's too early to know what the reaction is. And I think also probably the reaction will be different in Germany from Austria. I think in Germany, there has been a sort of coming to terms with what happened and with stories of individual family members. But in Austria, I think Horst's approach, which is to pass in silence on these matters, is perhaps more common. I write in the book how, by a rather amazing coincidence, one of the Wachter grandchildren married an Austrian lady who was a student of mine, and she invited me for dinner with her husband. So I met one of the grandchildren for dinner in Austria, and there was this really interesting moment as we're sitting there in a restaurant. The husband goes off for dinner to use the men's room, and she uses the opportunity to say, "Oh, Philippe, while my husband's gone, could I just ask you one question?" I said, "Of course." And she says, "Could you take steps to make sure that your book is never published in Austria?" And I say, "No, but why?" And she says, "Well, it's just, we need to protect the children. We've managed to cleanse the Wachter name. He's disappeared. And until your film and your podcast on the BBC, and now this book, life was much easier. You're just going to make life more difficult for the next generations, just as a friend, if you could." And that's the mindset. You pass in silence on the issues and you avoid a real reckoning. So I suspect the reaction in Austria will follow different political directions. But really interestingly, I think Austria too is changing. And it was very delightful and wonderful. The Austrian ambassador in London, Michael Zimmerman, wanted to do a launch event for the book at his residence. And I thought that said a lot about modern Austria, that there is now really a coming to terms with the Austrian role. And what it does crush completely is the idea that was run in the 1950s of Austria as the first victims of Nazism. That plainly wasn't the case. You only have to look at and see who was in the dog. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was Otto's best friend and who is Horst's godfather. And Horst sleeps with a photograph of his godfather next to his bed, still today. His godfather, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, hanged at Nuremberg just after Hans Frank. Interestingly, the book was published in Holland at the same time that it came out in England. The Dutch publisher wanted it out at exactly the same time. And it became a bestseller in Holland, which really surprised me. But the reason was Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the Nazi governor of Holland from 1940 to 1945. Still today, his is the most hated name in the Netherlands. And people were fascinated by the tidbits of information that came out about this man in the Ratline, the mate of Otto Wachter.
So I wanted to ask you, before we turn to some of the audience questions, about the impact of the book on you personally, because what began as a history of international law and and also a sort of inquiry into your personal family history. This is East-West Street, and Nuremberg has obviously developed into something so much bigger. But do you ever feel conflicted about having spent so much time with Horst, who? And so much time sort of trying to persuade Horst to see and to face up to the reality of his father?
You know, it's a really interesting question in this sense. It's been 10 years, and I have to say there is an element, I think, of mild repetition in the book because on occasion Horst is a broken record. But I had committed to Horst that I would absolutely let him have his say. I would faithfully reproduce his views. His views, I would say, so much as harden over the course of time. He became, as there was sort of an inverse relationship between the hardening of his position on one hand and the evidence available in support of his view that his father was a good man. If I found stuff, of course I would have put it in the book. There really isn't. There's nothing. There's literally nothing to show humanity or decency in relation to certain people who became his victims. Absolutely nothing at all. Beyond that, and perhaps even worse, 8,677 pages of archival material and not a single expression of regret at any point. In fact, it's even worse. After the war, in the 70s and 80s, Charlotte, she died in 85, would go around meeting old comrades and interviewing them and recording the interviews. And so I'm able to listen to Charlotte meeting, for example, a journalist, a real rabid Nazi journalist called Melita Wiedemann, in 77 in the cafe of the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich, having a good lunch. And Charlotte leaves the tape recorder on. I don't know whether it's purposeful or what, but so you hear them, clinking the glasses and eating and nattering away about the good old days and how brilliant Hitler was. Few excesses, perhaps, but basically he did well for us. I was a very active Nazi, says Charlotte. So was I, says Melita. Still am, says Charlotte. And that's 77. So, as I got deeper and deeper into the material, the relationship with Horst became more and more difficult. But of course, I don't want to give everything away. The big drama of the book, and there are a few, is what happens right at the end. When another family member comes out of the woodwork, having listened to the BBC podcast, which is still available, anyone can watch it. You just type in BBC The Ratline and you can listen to the 10-part series. But Horst's daughter Magdalena does not feature in the podcast. 1 hour after the last episode aired, I got an unbelievable email from her, and the book right at the end takes the direction of that email. And that has caused an almighty conflict between father and daughter, between the son of Otto and Charlotte and the granddaughter of Otto and Charlotte. And that takes us really into the next generation. So one of the aspects of all of this is the legacy aspect. And I've always wanted to treat Horst very correctly and very fairly. And a lot of people have asked me, why didn't I ever get more angry with him? Why am I so generous to him? Why do I give him so much space? Blah, blah, blah. But the upshot is it was important for me to do that. And I think in part, it's my training like your training, being in a courtroom, treating witnesses with respect, being courteous, not losing your rag, not becoming overly passionate. There is a restraint in my writing. That doesn't mean I have big and deep emotions about all of this, but I don't wear them on my sleeve. And I think that comes from my day job, doing international cases about crimes against humanity and genocide. It doesn't serve you in court, and I don't think it serves you on the pages of a book for me to be attacking Horst or painting him in a particular way. Horst, if you like, hangs himself with his own words. And it was my job simply to lay out the material and to do it fairly to him.
Yes, and I think he comes across, as you say, he's become a friend of yours. He's a very likable character in so many ways. He comes across.
Such a Nick really is a dear friend. Nick has become and that's very curious because Nick's father, of course, was hanged at Nuremberg for the murder of 4 million human beings. I had never met someone before whose father had done that. And I had never actually, to be honest, asked myself the question, what's it like to be the child or the grandchild of someone who's killed 4 million people? And can you imagine the burden of living with that? We did an event together, Nick, Frank and I, at the Hay Festival about 6-7 years ago, and it sold out like in 3 hours, 1,000 people. It was an extraordinary thing because you're with someone who can tell the story from the inside and does so with a brutal honesty, absolutely brutal honesty.
Yeah, and you can see the trauma kind of going on to the next generation with Magdalena as well, which itself is also extraordinary. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions so that we so to make sure we have time for them. Question from Clive Stafford Smith. Hello, Clive, a very near neighbour. Notwithstanding my own Jewish background, I still want to know what Otto's mitigation is, like all our clients on death row. What is it, in your view?
I do actually feel like asking Clive a question back of whether he would have subjected Hans Frank to the death penalty back in 1945, but I won't. I've been asked that question a lot, and I've thought about it a lot, and I oscillate. So Horst's account is that government in Nazi Germany, and in particular in the territories occupied by Nazi Germany, was divided between two branches, the civilian government and the SS government. And Horst's narrative is that the civilian government just dealt with the ordinary daily things of life, housing, food, transport, and that the real mass murderer in Lemberg was a man called Katzmann, who was the head of the SS. The problem with Horst's narrative is that food, housing, and transport includes, I'm sorry to say, ghetto, identification of Jews for hard labor, and of course, transportation and rounding up for Belzec. And the difficulty for Horst is compounded by the fact that by 1944, Otto Wächter's rank in the SS was precisely one below Heinrich Himmler, his mentor. So Horst tries to pass that off as he was an honorary member of the SS. He was absolutely not an honorary member of the SS. As late as the summer of 44, Hitler is personally elevating him to Brigadeführer, Gruppenführer, right at the top of the table, and his closest mate is Heinrich Himmler. And we know that in a very real sense because in the archive are the letters from Otto and Charlotte about the lovely gifts that come from Heinrich when a child is born, and the help that's given, and packets of coffee when supplies become difficult. So the argument essentially is Otto was part of an organ of government that was not charged with the extermination of the Jews. The problem with that argument is addressed in the book. The United States Department of Justice, which has been, for example, tracing Ukrainians who live in the United States and trying to get them sent back to Germany, Poland for trial for their activities in those parts of the world, has carried out an extensive analysis of how decisions were A, taken, and B, implemented, and Otto Wächter's fingers are all over them, just like Seyss-Inquart, who was convicted and hanged. And I think, I've thought sometimes, how would I make the case for Wächter? I don't think there's a case to be made for Wächter. I think it's overwhelming. And the real question is, why does Horst persist? And the answer, I think, to that question has nothing to do with his relationship with his father, but everything to do with his relationship with his mother. He didn't really know his father. He keeps saying that to me. What he says, however, is his mother loved his father. I loved my mother. I must take forward my mother's efforts in presenting my father in a good light. And it's my duty as a son to do everything I can to take forward the work and the love of my mother. That's his thesis.
Yeah, and it seems quite clear he'll never shift from that at all.
I mean, I describe in the book, 8,677 pages. It really is a lot of pages, and it's all in German. And it was only right at the end that I came across an email. I must have ignored it because it was a modern document in German where Horst sends an email to his nephew, Otto Jr. It's on the archives. You can find it now at the Holocaust Museum. I write about it in the book. He writes to his nephew, this is 2007. He says, I've been through all the documents now, and I'm afraid there is no escaping the fact that he knew everything and he was completely involved in everything. So this is really interesting for me. 2007, he's sort of where I am. What happened between 2007 and when I met him in early 2011 to change his mind? That I don't know. But what I do know is that between 2011 and 2020, his position has hardened dramatically. And Nicholas Frank, who has a rather good sense of humor, will often turn to me, including at public events, and say, "You're the one, Philippe. You're the one who's hardened him. You've turned him into this new Nazi. You've caused him to harden his position. You're the one to blame for all this stuff." He says it partly jokingly, but there is an element, I think, where I ask myself, yeah, well, there is a sort of correlation between my arrival on the scene, the positions that Horst articulates today, which are, shall we say, a lot firmer than when I first met him.
So a question now from Haroon Shawani. Thank you for this fascinating account. May I ask if you saw much trace of religion in these expressions of ideology, or was it a very post-Christian worldview? And actually that also relates to a question I had for you about the role of the Catholic Church and Bishop Hudal, and whether it was representative of what generally was going on in the Catholic Church, or was Bishop Hudal an isolated individual?
So the religion side is very significant, I think. Charlotte came from a Protestant family, and Otto came from a Catholic family. But I didn't know this until I did the research for this book. As you went up the SS ranks, you had to swear absolute allegiance to the Führer. It was called becoming Gottgläubig, so that the reverence to the Führer became the new religion, and you ditched your adherence, in Otto's case, to Catholicism, which he did formally at a ceremony in 1937. But by 1945, when he's in danger, all of a sudden there's a sort of magical reconnection with the Catholic Church, not least because, as I describe in the book, elements of the Vatican are vital to his safety, particularly when he arrives in Rome. Now, again, as I said, it's all anonymized, but on the first day in Rome, the 29th of April, 1949, he writes a letter to Charlotte, and he says, "Marvelous, arrived safely, train's a bit late, the person who was supposed to meet me wasn't there, but I've teamed up with the religious gentleman." Who's the religious gentleman? The religious gentleman is Alois Hudal, who basically ran the Ratline. Mengele, Priebke, Haas, all these ghastly individuals, not Eichmann, but many, many others. And he was the highest ranking Austrian bishop in the Vatican, in the Catholic Church, at the Anima Institute, which I went to visit and spent time at. And what, of course, then becomes even more interesting, which of course was a real astonishment for me, which I did not know. I'd read a little bit about Hudal, but most people do not know that in 1947, Hudal was recruited by the Americans. He became a spy for the Americans against the Bolsheviks, against the communists. And there was an alliance between the CIC, forerunner of the CIA, run by the marvelous Thomas Lucid, who recruits 9 people to run the campaign against the Soviets in Rome and in Italy. 3 Italian fascists, including the Secretary General of the Italian Fascist Party, becomes a paid American spy, $50 in cash each month. 4 senior Nazis, senior mass murdering SS officers recruited by the Americans. And as astonishing, or even more astonishingly, 2 senior Vatican officials. One is the Pope's chief press spokesperson. So Pius XII's chief press spokesperson is in the pay of the Americans, $50 a month for 4 years. And Alois Hudal. Upshot being that the moment Otto arrives in Rome and falls into the arms of Bishop Hudal, thinking he's obtained safety from the Americans who are hunting him, the very first thing that Shute does within 24 hours is report to the Americans the arrival of Otto Wachter, aka Alfredo Reinhardt. So this really confused me. And there's a section in the book where I go to my neighbor, who happens to be a writer of spy novels, John le Carré, to ask him what the hell is going on. How can this be that the British and the Americans are working with the Nazis as early as 47, 48, 49? And he says to me, as I describe in the book, well, Philippe, I was there in 49. I was in Austria and I was interrogating Germans and Nazis. And I said, for what purpose? To subject them to prosecution? He said, no, not at all, to recruit them. And this is, I think, morally where a lot of questions arise. I did not know that. And I think most people are not aware of that and do not realize that the Ratline is essentially an American-run operation. That was a shock.
Yeah, it was a shock to me too. There's a couple of questions in relation to Carlotta and whether she should have been tried for something, aiding and abetting. I mean, she was in the open. She held her hands up as a Nazi. She befriended the Americans afterwards, and nothing happened. No consequences for her. Should there have been?
I don't know. This is a really interesting question. I mean, it goes beyond the Nazi period into all periods generally. I mean, for those of us who have partners, very often we know it is to our partner that we turn when we come to issues of complexity, to dilemmas. I mean, I will very often turn to Natalia, my wife, and say, look, this case has come in. I'm not quite sure. What should I do? Or I've got a decision to make. Do I go down this path or do I go down that path? And I think it's the big untold story. A spouse who says to her husband, you know what, I don't want you to become a lawyer. Take the job in government service and remove all the Jews from public office. That's what you should be doing. And in the sections of her diaries and reminiscences, the only thing she writes about her husband in relation to that period was that the stress levels were so great that he had to have 10 teeth removed. So she just passes in complete silence on what he's doing, but she knows exactly what he's doing because in some of the letters he describes what he's doing. The most infamous letter, Krakow, 1939, December the 17th, my darling Humi, marvelous here in Krakow. The Vienna Philharmonic has been, Baldur von Schirach and the other ministers are coming to celebrate me. It's all going very well. A little bit of local difficulty. The Governor General, attempt on his life. Tomorrow I have to have 50 Poles shot. So I checked that out. And it was a very notorious act of killing of 50 Polish young boys. Basically, I've put the photograph in the book. It's a shocking photograph, but it needed to be put in the book. And it was a direct order from Hitler to Wachter, first act of reprisal killing in occupied Poland. 25 Poles to die for every German soldier killed by partisan attacks. And she knew about it all. So does that make her criminally responsible? Probably not. But is she complicit in a broader moral sense? Absolutely. Because if she had turned around and said, you know what, enough of this nonsense, I don't find this acceptable. The third book in the series, which is the story of a minor character in the Ratline, Walter Rauff, who's in the same place as Wachter in Rome and then escapes first to Syria and then to Chile. And he arrives in Chile in 55, becomes a small businessman, and then in 73, it is said, becomes a leading interrogator for the intelligence services, the DINA, of General Pinochet's new government post-coup. And he interrogates a number of people, one of whom writes an affidavit in 1990 describing how he was interrogated and tortured by Walter Rauff. And that material makes its way onto my desk in 1998 in London when Senator Pinochet is arrested on the 16th of October. I'm approached on the 20th of October. I'm in Paris, actually, curious enough, going to the cemetery in Paris where my grandfather is buried. And at the cemetery, I meet my wife. And this is actually how the book will open. And I say to her, oh, really interesting. Pinochet's lawyers have been on to me. they want to hire me. And she just looks at me and she says, you act for Senator Pinochet and I will be divorcing you tomorrow. And that's the kind of role one spouse will have. Charlotte was a different kind of spouse. Does that make her criminally liable? Probably not, but it sure makes her morally liable in my book.
Right. So a question from Sue. When you read descriptions of Hitler's table talk, it's appalling. So many are in agreement with the views that Otto shares. My question is about the seeming mass hypnosis. And is there a spell that breaks for some in defeat, but also therefore for not others?
I think this is a very pertinent question for right now. I think we've been watching what's been happening in the United States. It's very clear. I want to be clear, I'm not for a moment saying Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. He is not. But he has a charisma, plainly. He has a way of connecting with people which causes even some fairly reasonable people to support him. I mean, 73 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. And one of the key questions I think a lot of people are asking themselves, how personal is that vote to Trump? I happen to think that it is. And that once you take Trump off the scene, and it's not clear he's going to go off the scene, a lot of that support will die down. You need a charismatic figure. And Hitler was plainly that charismatic figure. When you take a person like that out of the story, the movement collapses. And of course, one of the things that is so interesting is that in the past 75 years, as you know, I mentioned earlier, I was invited to Nuremberg's courtroom 600 by the German president. And I was there 2 weeks ago talking about all of these issues. And I raised the point, sitting in courtroom 600 with President Steinmeier, could you ever have imagined 75 years ago, on the opening day of the trial, 20th of November 1945, that in 75 years' time, Germany would be the country which had a commitment to the idea of the rule of law internationally and committed to principles of liberal democracy, and the United States, and also, I'm sorry to say, Britain, under this current leadership, have just walked away from the 1945 settlement and the system of multilateral rules-based order that they created. And that, I think, raises questions of charisma. Johnson has it to a lesser extent, but he's obviously got something. When you look at I'm trying not to be party political here, which is not what I want to be, but the disconnect between delivery on the one hand, on the greatest threat many of us have faced, coronavirus, the degree of support for Trump and Johnson should have just collapsed, but it hasn't. And that, I think, is due to individual charisma rather than a belief in the substantive competence of these two men. And Hitler was the same. People believed him right till the end. Read Charlotte's Wächter's letters in 45. They know the war is over. Wächter knows by the end of 44, it's over, the war is lost. But they blindly stay with Hitler. They blindly continue the support. The Heil Hitlers at the bottom of the letter continue right up to the end of the spring of 1945. What is that about? But then it collapses, completely collapses. Now, it may come back in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 50 years. I don't know. Nicholas Frank is particularly worried about that. But it hasn't come back in 75 years. And the greater dangers to the world right now are not Germany, frankly. It's Britain and the United States.
Right. I mean, you can see, in looking at the sort of laws that were passed in the Third Reich, it was legal what was being done. That's what's frightening. But we can also see here, there are some very appalling laws being passed in relation to foreigners, detentions, asylum seekers, and all sorts of other things, which are, on the face of it, they are legal. They're black letter law.
Well, they're not. Here we now have, for the first time, here I'm speaking, I suppose, more as a barrister and as an academic, for the first time we have, it has never happened in the history of the British government, in the history of the United Kingdom, that a government has laid before Parliament a bill which on its face violates a treaty obligation to which the United Kingdom has entered into within the past 9 months. I can't tell you how shocking that is, Sam. It has in an instant destroyed Britain's reputation for trust, for credibility, and for the commitment to the rule of law. It will take years and years and years to repair that. And one of the reasons the European Union, quite rightly in my view, is playing hardball right now with the United Kingdom is that they no longer trust the British government. And that is because for decades, Britain, the United Kingdom were consonant with the idea of a commitment to the rule of law. Boom, a moment that has evaporated. And of course, the road to that is not entirely dissimilar to what passed in the 30s and the 40s. Many of you will recall the headlines in the newspapers, enemies of the people, when three independent, politically neutral judges give a judgment in the Court of Appeal, which certain members of the government don't like, and 10 Downing Street orchestrates, I believe, a campaign against those three judges, enemies of the people. It's absolutely shocking what has happened. And the thing that I'm trying to do with the Ratline in particular is to tell a story which explains how, when you start crossing lines and you get away with it, you move up the ladder and eventually you cross a line, which is the line into mass mistreatment and eventually mass murder. That's what happens. And that's what's been going on in the United States, which thankfully, at least for the next 4 years, has brought this to an end. But in the United Kingdom, I'm sorry to say, we are still subject to this abject nonsense, which is undermining a historic commitment to the rule of law. And it's tragic what is going on. Absolutely tragic.
So one final question before we finish, and perhaps, trying to draw some of the strands together on a more optimistic, forward-thinking note. I mean, if there's one thing or one impact that you hope the Ratline will have, what would it be?
To understand how ordinary, decent, intelligent, loving, humane, familial individuals can get involved in mass murder. I think it's the question all of us have to ask ourselves. What would we do in certain circumstances? At what point might we be driven into a direction of crossing lines? The story of the Ratline is the story of lines being crossed by Otto and Charlotta. The first lines are pretty innocuous, but hey, they get away with it. And you move up the greasy pole. And then the next line comes across and you get across that one. And hey, the world doesn't come crashing down on your head. And I think the simple message and the lesson is you've got to stick and be true to your fundamental principles. You cannot turn a blind eye. You cannot cross certain lines, because the moment you do that, you enter a space which leads to catastrophe. And I think that's the dangerous situation we have been in this country and in the United States, although the dangers in the United States are diminished. And I rather suspect that with the demise of Donald Trump, the steam will be taken out of the movement, both in the United Kingdom and in other places which are taking similar nationalistic, xenophobic, racist directions, Poland and Hungary. But the danger remains. And I think we have to be constantly vigilant. And what the Ratline story tells us is how a couple from, in her case, a wealthy, decent, religious background, in his case, a military father, lived in, upper middle class circumstances, decent, no absence of, the basics of life, could cross those lines. And that, I think, is the moral of the story. And I do not believe that it is a peculiarly German or Austrian trait. I think it's a universal trait. And the cases that I do around the world make it absolutely clear that the starting point for things going wrong is the moment you begin to get into a language of them and us. And right now in this country, we're in this language of them and us. And we've got to tone down the rhetoric and find ways to deal with the substance of our differences without putting people or entire regions into categories of the other, because that's what leads to a really bad place.
Philippe, thank you. It's been an amazing hour. Really look forward to your next book, to you coming to Shute in person for more conversations about this. I can't recommend Ratline highly enough. And East West Street, I should say. My East West Street is left in Miami. It's made its way onto the syllabus at the university there. But I mean, this is the sort of book that should be on every history syllabus, and which I wish had been on the syllabus when I was studying the Third Reich. If you haven't already got the Ratline, please do buy it through our wonderful local indie bookshop, Archway Bookshop, who can deliver you a signed copy anywhere in the UK and beyond. And thank you to you all for coming tonight, for your questions. Thank you also for your donations. Without this, we couldn't have got through this year. We're going to retreat to the hills and moors this winter for reflection, and we will be back for sure in 2021, and what we hope will be a better year in every way. But in the meantime, stay engaged and stay well. Thank you, Philippe, and goodbye.
Thank you so much, Sam, and everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and be well and be safe and be modestly optimistic, because with a bit of luck, by the spring of next year, things will hopefully be a lot better.